Share your deep bond with your husband and how his death shattered your world. Describe your grief and how you expected family to be your support system afterward. I still remember the way he smiled at me the first time we met. It wasn't just kindness, it was safety, comfort, and something that told me deep down that I had found someone who would walk beside me through life. And he did for many years. He wasn't perfect, but he was mine. We built a life together, one filled with quiet moments, little victories, and an understanding that didn't always need words. That kind of love doesn't just disappear when someone dies. It lingers in the quiet, in the spaces where their presence used to be. And it breaks your heart over and over again, every single day. When he passed away, it felt like the ground under me just gave way. I wasn't just losing a husband. I was losing the rhythm of my life. Waking up without his breath beside me, walking past his chair at the table, catching myself talking to him out loud and remembering halfway through that he's not there to answer. Grief, real grief, doesn't just hurt. Hollows you out. I told myself I had to be strong. For my children, for our memory, for the family he left behind. I believed that if I stayed close to them, especially his father, we could hold each other up. I wanted to believe we shared the same grief. That we were bound by love and loss and that, together, we would somehow survive the pain. I clung to that idea like it was a rope in a storm. But life has a cruel way of peeling back the truth. The man I thought would be a source of support, a kind of anchor in all that loss, slowly began to change. Or maybe he didn't change at all. Maybe I had never really seen him before. First, it was subtle. Comments that felt off, but I brushed them aside. Short tempers, criticisms masked as concern, boundary lines being nudged further and further until one day, they were just gone. Grief makes you vulnerable. You move slower, think less clearly. You second-guess your instincts because nothing feels normal. And when someone uses that space to assert power, to chip away at your sense of self, you don't always see it coming. Not at first. I was mourning my husband, his son, while trying to maintain peace, and what I didn't realize was that I was shrinking. Silently, bit by bit, I was folding into myself, losing my voice in a house that should have felt familiar but had grown foreign. I didn't talk about it. Not with my children, not with friends. Partly because I didn't want to cause more pain. Partly because I didn't want to admit what was happening. There's a kind of shame that sneaks in when you're mistreated by someone who's supposed to protect you. Especially as a woman, especially as a mother, and especially when people see you as strong. I wore that strength like armor, but underneath I was unraveling. I would lie awake at night wishing for one more day with my husband, not just because I missed him, but because I felt like he was the only person who truly saw me. And with him gone, it was as if I had faded out of existence. No one noticed. No one asked. I smiled when I needed to, nodded through conversations, made tea, folded laundry, and in every movement, I tried to hold myself together. But grief doesn't keep its shape. Spills out in unexpected ways. And what I didn't know then was that my pain, my silence, had made me a target. Not for pity, not for comfort, but for control. Before I could understand what was happening, I was already too deep in it. Too tired. Too broken. And still trying to believe that somehow, this was just another phase of grief. That if I stayed quiet long enough, if I gave enough, if I endured just a little more, it would pass. That he would soften. That he, too, was just hurting. But that's not what grief does. That's what cruelty does. And still, in those early days after my husband died, I kept telling myself this family would hold together. I believed love was stronger than sorrow. I believed I could carry the weight. I was wrong. After the funeral, things moved quickly. The house felt too quiet, too still, like time itself had paused and was waiting for me to catch up. I was still in the middle of sorting through memories, trying to figure out how to live without the man who had been at the center of my world, and yet the world around me kept spinning. Bills still arrived, meals still had to be made, and family. His family started coming around more often. First, I was grateful. His father offered to help with errands, repairs, things I didn't have the energy to even think about. He said, "You shouldn't be alone right now." And I agreed. I told myself this was love. This was what family was supposed to do. He even stayed over some nights, saying he didn't want me to feel lonely. I told myself it was temporary, just until I could get my feet back under me. I wanted to believe that. But something started to shift. Slowly, then all at once. The first time I noticed it, I was in the kitchen, my kitchen, and I reached for a plate on the wrong shelf. Snap. Not with rage, not at that point, but with something sharper than I expected. That's not where it goes. Your husband always kept them on the other side. I froze, plate in hand, unsure of how to respond. It was such a small thing. But it was the tone, the way he said it. As if I had disrupted the natural order of things. As if I had failed some invisible rule I didn't know I was supposed to follow. I laughed it off. Because that's what we do, isn't it? We minimize. We find excuses. He's grieving, I told myself. He's just trying to hold on to something familiar. But little things kept happening. Comments about how I should dress, what I should cook, who I should talk to. Suddenly my choices were being questioned, subtly then not so subtly. I remember one morning, I told him I was thinking of visiting a friend. Nothing dramatic, just tea and conversation, a breath of air. His face tightened. Is that really necessary? He asked. You should be spending time with family, not running around with outsiders. That word, outsiders, clung to me. I felt like a child being scolded for something harmless, something normal. But again I stayed quiet. I had just lost my husband. I didn't want to stir anything up. I didn't want to believe what I was starting to see. And yet, the line between kindness and control blurred more each day. He started showing up in places I didn't expect. The grocery store. Outside my church. Watching. Not always speaking but always there. It didn't feel like care. Felt like surveillance. Then came the boundaries. Or the lack of them. He would walk into my bedroom without knocking. He would comment on my body, sometimes in a half-joking tone, sometimes not. I told myself I was imagining things. That my grief had made me hypersensitive. That surely no one who shared my loss would act like this. But deep down I knew something was wrong. The worst part wasn't the words. It was the silence that followed them. The way he'd pretend nothing happened. The way I'd force myself to move on, to stay polite, to keep the peace. Because confronting it felt too big, too terrifying. I didn't want to be alone. I didn't want to lose the last connection to my husband. So I tolerated it. I adjusted. I began to anticipate his moods, to change my routine, my behavior, to avoid setting him off. What I didn't realize then was how easy it is to lose yourself while trying to protect your version of family. One compromise turns into another, and before you know it, you're not making decisions anymore. You're surviving. People ask me how I was doing, but only in passing. And I always smiled, always answered, I'm managing. I wore that answer like a mask. Because if I told the truth, I was afraid of what might come next. Would anyone believe me? Would they take his side? Would they think I was confused, unstable, bitter? And more than that, would speaking up break whatever fragile structure I had left? That fear kept me quiet. But the shift had already happened. My home no longer felt like my own. I tiptoed through it, measuring each word, each gesture. The man who should have mourned with me had instead filled the silence with something far more frightening. Control wrapped in the disguise of concern. I wasn't just grieving my husband anymore. I was beginning to grieve myself. There's a moment when the sorrow you carry begins to change shape. At first it's heavy but still familiar. You can name it grief, loss, mourning. But then, slowly, it turns into something else. Something darker. It begins to twist around your days, slipping into the way you move, the way you speak, the way you think. And one morning, you wake up and realize you're no longer just sad. You're afraid. I remember the first time I actually felt fear in my own home. Real fear. The kind that settles in your chest and makes your breath shallow. It wasn't a loud outburst or a raised hand. It was quieter than that. He was standing in the hallway, blocking my path. I had simply asked him to give me a moment of privacy. That was all. And the way he looked at me, so still, so cold, it stopped me mid-sentence. His eyes didn't flash with anger. They were There was no yelling. He just stared like I had said something unforgivable. Then he stepped closer. Just a few inches. Close enough that I could feel his breath. Close enough that I had to lower my eyes. And I remember thinking, this isn't grief anymore. After that, it was as if a switch had flipped. He no longer made an effort to hide the way he watched me, the way he touched my things, the way he treated me like I was something he owned. He'd say things like, "You're lucky I'm here to take care of you," or "Where else would you go?" And the more he said it, the more I started to believe it. Not because it was true, but because I was tired. Because grief does something to your sense of worth. It makes you feel like you're less than what you once were, like your broken heart has made you smaller somehow. Every day I'd tell myself, just get through today. Just today. That's how I lived. One day at a time, shrinking a little more with each sunrise. I stopped talking to people. Stopped answering phone calls. Stopped going anywhere that might give me even a few moments of fresh air or connection. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid of what might happen if I did. Afraid of what he'd say. Afraid of what he might do. Strange the way fear works. It doesn't always come with bruises or broken bones. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like a forced smile across the dinner table. Sometimes it's the sound of your own voice going quiet because you've been corrected one too many times. And when you live in that for long enough, you stop needing bars on a window to feel imprisoned. There were moments when I thought about packing a bag. Just leaving. But then I'd hear his footsteps down the hall, or find one of my personal items moved, like a reminder that there was nowhere I could go that he wouldn't find me. And so I stayed. I stayed because I didn't want to make things worse. I stayed because I was convinced that maybe I was being dramatic, maybe this was just part of the grieving process, for both of us. I stayed because I didn't want to admit, not even to myself, that I was being mistreated by someone I had once called family. I started having dreams that I was underwater. No matter how hard I tried to swim to the surface, something kept pulling me down. I'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, heart pounding. And even in the safety of daylight, the dream clung to me. Because that's what fear does. It follows you even when nothing is happening. Even when it's quiet. Especially when it's quiet. I knew I needed help, but I didn't know how to ask for it. I didn't even know what words to use. How do you tell someone that the man who brings you groceries also stares at you too long when you bend over? How do you say that the man who prays at your husband's grave controls who you see and where you go? How do you explain that you feel more alone now, surrounded by family, than you ever did before? So I said nothing. I made his tea. I nodded when he spoke. I apologized for things that weren't my fault. And every time I looked in the mirror, I saw someone I didn't recognize anymore. A ghost of the woman I had been. A woman who once had a husband who loved her, who laughed freely, who held her head high. She was gone, replaced by someone who had learned to walk lightly, to speak carefully, to exist quietly so she wouldn't provoke whatever was waiting underneath his calm exterior. I didn't realize it then, but I had already started begging. Not out loud. Not yet. But in my heart I was pleading. Please, let me make it through this day without upsetting him. Please let him leave me alone. Please let someone see me. People always say that a mother will do anything to protect her children. And I believe that. I believed it every time I smiled when I wanted to cry, every time I kept my voice steady when I was trembling inside, every time I said, "It's fine, everything's okay," just to avoid letting them see how broken I was becoming. I wasn't just surviving for me. I was surviving for them. There's a strange kind of calculation that happens when you're living in fear. You start measuring every action against the possible consequences. If I push back, what will he do? If I ignore it, will it get worse? And more often than not, the biggest question I asked myself was, will this affect my children? Because if it was just me, I thought I could take it. I told myself I could endure anything as long as I kept them safe. The problem was, I wasn't really keeping them safe. Not in the way I wanted to. I was teaching them, without meaning to, that silence was the price of peace. That being quiet was safer than speaking truth. And deep down I hated myself for that. I hated the thought that they might see me as weak, or worse, start to believe that what was happening around them was normal. But how do you explain this kind of thing to your children? Especially when they're grieving too. I didn't want to add to their pain. They'd already lost their father. I didn't want them to lose their idea of family too. I kept thinking, maybe this will pass. Maybe if I just hang on a little longer, he'll calm down. He'll remember who I am to him. But that day never came. Instead, I adjusted. I scheduled my day around his moods. I learned to cook his meals the way he liked them, to answer before he had to call my name twice, to excuse the comments that made my skin crawl, because correcting him only brought worse. It wasn't just about fear anymore, it was about control. He wanted obedience. He wanted to feel powerful. And I gave him what he wanted because I was too exhausted to do anything else. There were moments though, small ones, where I'd catch a glimpse of the old me. Like when my granddaughter would climb onto my lap and whisper secrets in my ear, giggling as if the world outside our little bubble didn't exist. In those moments, I remembered who I used to be. The woman who used to read bedtime stories in silly voices, who used to sing in the kitchen while cooking, who used to believe that her home was sacred. I missed her more than I could admit. And I wondered if they looked at me now, would they still see her? One evening after dinner, my youngest child, so quiet, so observant, looked at me and said, "Mom, you seem smaller lately." That word, smaller, hit me like a blow. Because that's exactly what I had become. Smaller in spirit, in presence, in voice. And they had noticed. No matter how hard I tried to hide it, no matter how carefully I played the part, they were watching. They were learning. And what terrified me most wasn't what he might do to me. It was what I might be teaching them without meaning to. That women endure. That love is earned through silence. That being good means being obedient, even when it hurts. I wanted so badly to protect them, but I was starting to understand that protection didn't mean keeping secrets. It didn't mean pretending everything was fine. Real protection, real strength, meant telling the truth even when it's ugly. Even when it breaks the illusion of family. But I was scared. Not just of him, but of what might happen if I opened that door. Would they believe me? Would they be angry at me for letting it go on so long? Would they think I was weak? I couldn't bear the thought of disappointing them, of being the one to tear apart what little was left of our family after their father died. So I waited. I waited far too long. I let too many things slide. I let myself disappear in the name of love, in the name of motherhood, in the name of peace. And it wasn't peace. It was survival. Looking back, I know that my silence didn't shield them. It shadowed them. It shaped them in ways I couldn't see then. And that's the guilt I carry more than anything else. Not just what happened to me, but what they had to witness, what they had to unlearn later. I stayed quiet to protect them, but silence became its own kind of harm. There comes a moment when your body starts speaking for you, even when your mouth stays closed. It was subtle at first. Tightness in my chest, shallow breaths, constant fatigue I couldn't shake. I thought it was just the weight of grief, just the long days and longer nights wearing me down. But the truth was, my body had been holding in more than sorrow. It had been holding in fear, resentment, and humiliation for so long that it had nowhere left to store it. I started forgetting things. Simple things. I'd find myself standing in the kitchen, not remembering why I walked in. I'd rewash clean clothes because I couldn't remember folding them. My hands would shake for no reason. I couldn't sleep, and when I did, I woke up in a panic, heart pounding like I was being chased in my dreams. And maybe I was. Chased by the version of myself I kept losing, chased by the truth I didn't want to face. It wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just about what he said or did. It was about what I had become. I was tired of tiptoeing around my own house. Tired of apologizing for taking up space. Tired of explaining away his behavior to others, and to myself. There's something deeply painful about realizing that your survival has come at the cost of your dignity. I used to think of myself as a woman with strength, a woman who had been through life and still stood tall. But somewhere along the way I had started curling inward, folding up, breaking down. It all built up quietly, piece by piece. Until one afternoon, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I had just finished making tea. I set his cup down, and he didn't even say thank you. He looked at it, then at me, and said, "Finally. Took you long enough." I don't know why that was the moment. I don't know why those particular words cut so deep. But something inside me cracked open. I walked to the other room and sat down at the edge of my bed. And I cried. Not the quiet kind of crying you do when you're trying to stay strong. I mean the kind of crying that comes from your bones. From the place where you've been burying everything you couldn't say out loud. I cried until I couldn't breathe. And then I did something I had never done before. Not with him, not with anyone. Begged. I begged out loud to no one in particular. I whispered it at first. Please. Please stop. Please leave me alone. And then I said it louder. Please. I can't do this anymore. It was like a flood broke open inside me, and everything came rushing out. The fear. The hurt. The anger. The grief. I didn't care anymore if he heard me. I didn't care if the neighbors heard me. I had reached a point where my pride didn't matter. Only my freedom did. He did hear me. He walked in, looked at me, and for the first time I think he saw what he had done. Or maybe he just realized that his power over me had started to slip. I'll never forget the look on his face. Not anger, not guilt, but something colder. Indifference. That's when I knew I had to save myself, because he was never going to stop. Not because he couldn't, but because he didn't want to. The begging didn't fix anything overnight. It didn't make him change. But it changed me. It woke me up. It reminded me that my voice still existed. That I was still in there somewhere, under the fear, under the silence. That woman I used to be. She was bruised but not gone. She was still fighting for air. After that moment I started to make quiet plans. I reached out to someone I trusted, just one person. I told them a little, just enough. And when they didn't turn away, I told them more. It wasn't easy. It was terrifying. But once I opened that door, even a crack, I couldn't close it again. And I didn't want to. People think begging is weakness. But I'll tell you what it really is. It's the final cry of someone who has been strong for far too long. It's the moment when the soul says, enough. When survival demands more than endurance, it demands truth. And in that moment, with my hands shaking and my face soaked in tears, I begged not just for him to stop. I begged for myself to start living again. When you've been held down for so long, by fear, by silence, by shame, freedom doesn't arrive like a marching band. Comes quietly. Sometimes in the form of one small decision. One sentence said out loud. One step in a different direction. For me, freedom didn't come all at once. It came piece by piece, breath by breath, like learning how to walk again after being numb for too long. I didn't wake up one day fearless. I was still afraid, even when I decided to leave. But I had something stronger than fear by then. I had clarity. I knew I couldn't keep living the way I was living. Not for me, not for my children, not for the memory of the man I had loved. I looked around one day and saw the walls closing in. Not the physical walls of the house, but the emotional ones, the ones that keep you from remembering who you are. I thought, if I stay here, I will vanish completely. And I wasn't ready to vanish. I had a few quiet allies. People who had noticed things but didn't push. They waited for me to be ready, and when I finally whispered, "I need help," they didn't ask questions. They just showed up. One friend helped me pack a bag. Another gave me a place to sleep for a while. I didn't have a grand plan. I didn't even have all the answers. But I had a beginning. And sometimes that's all you need. Leaving didn't mean the story ended. If anything, it became more complicated. There was judgment. There were people who asked, "Why now? After all this time?" As if suffering has an expiration date. As if endurance should be rewarded with more silence. But I didn't answer to them. Couldn't. Because the only voice I could afford to listen to now was the one I'd buried deep inside. The one that had been whispering, "You deserve more than this." There were days when I questioned everything. When I felt guilt so heavy it sat on my chest like stone. When I missed the version of family I thought I had. When I mourned not only my husband but the life I believed we would grow old in. I had to grieve all over again. Not for him this time, but for myself. For the years I gave away. For the parts of me I had quieted to keep the peace. But healing, I learned, isn't a straight path. It's not neat. It's jagged and slow and messy. Still, little by little, I started to feel something return. I started noticing beauty again. In the way sunlight came through the curtains, in the way my granddaughter laughed, in the sound of my own footsteps when I walked into a room I was free to leave. I started writing again, just in a journal, just a few lines. I'd write, "Today I breathed without fear." Or, "Today I laughed and didn't feel guilty for it." Small victories, but they felt like mountains. One of the most powerful moments came when I looked in the mirror and didn't see a victim anymore. I saw a survivor. I saw a woman who had walked through fire and didn't burn down completely. Yes, I carried scars. Yes, I still had days when the past crept up on me. But I also had strength I didn't know I had. Not the kind that comes from fighting back, but the kind that comes from getting up again and again when you could have stayed down. I started talking. Not just to friends, but to other women who had walked a path like mine. I listened to their stories. I shared pieces of mine. And I realized how powerful we become when we stop pretending. When we stop hiding. There's something sacred in truth, even when it hurts. Because truth doesn't shame you, it sets you free. I often think about my husband. I think about how heartbroken he would be if he had seen what happened to me after he was gone. And I hold on to the memory of his love. Because it reminds me that I am worthy of being cherished, not controlled. I don't believe he left me to this fate. I believe he's the reason I found the strength to leave it behind. Now, when I see my children, I hold them close. And I hold my head even higher. Because they see me now. Not as a woman who stayed quiet, but as a woman who found her voice. Who made it through the darkest part of her story and stepped into the light. Not perfectly, but completely herself. And for the first time in a long time, I feel alive.